Good morning. Sorry about that technical difficulty. My name is Linda Willard. I'm a counsel here at Denton's in the energy practice, and I'm also the executive director of the Denton's Global Think Tank and Smart Cities Connected Communities Think Tank. And today, on behalf of the think tank, I would like to welcome everyone to today's roundtable, focusing on the opportunities and challenges faced by tribal energy projects in the U.S. Our Smart Cities think tank, which has almost 800 members and 18 pillars, hosts monthly virtual roundtables like this one on a variety of key topics, including uh, one is done under our tribal pillar, but many are in the energy space, technology, social infrastructure, transportation, AI, etc. Membership in our think tank is free, and we encourage you to join us as a panelist at one of our roundtables, contributor to our content, or as a regular part of our audience. We have a terrific panel that we want to get to, so I will be brief. Today's theme is an important one. Our panelists will focus on the unique intersection of opportunity and complexity in the context of developing energy projects on tribal lands. Working with tribes and other entities to develop energy resources on Indian lands holds enormous potential, both for renewable and conventional energy projects, but development efforts often face legal, regulatory, financial, and infrastructure-related challenges. My colleague, Suzanne Schaefer, who will be moderating today's panel, is a counsel in the Denton's Regulatory Public Policy and Government Affairs practice here in Washington, D.C. Susie's practice concentrates on Indian lands and environmental compliance issues. She draws on her years of experience in both the federal government and in private practice to resolve legal issues pertaining to Indian lands, natural resources, and the federal environmental regulatory system. Susie has advised numerous tribal clients in navigating federal regulations and policies related to the unique development of energy projects on tribal lands. And without further fanfare, Susie, I turn the mic over to you and look forward to enjoying today's panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda, and welcome everybody to today's roundtable on tribal energy projects. As Linda said, we're going to explore some of the issues that come up in connection with those projects, legal and regulatory issues, financial, programmatic challenges, infrastructure, cultural and environmental considerations, and hopefully some, solutions and opportunities. So we're going to do that. We're going to talk with our four very accomplished panelists who bring different, but all have significant expertise and experience with tribal energy development. So I'm going to start with Dr. Crystal Miller, who is the head of policy and government relations at the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. She is an enrolled citizen of the Walker River Paiute tribe and a nationally recognized expert in federal Indian law, tribal governance, and indigenous policy reform. She got her PhD from the University of Arizona, where her research focused on federal Indian law and policy, tribal constitutional reform, and strengthening tribal governance structures. She's a leading voice in national policy advocacy and government relations. She regularly engages with members of Congress, federal agencies, and intergovernmental bodies to advance tribal sovereignty, environmental justice, and equitable resource distribution. Her work has directly influenced legislative and administrative actions, ensuring that the voices and rights of Native nations are represented at the highest levels of government. She's played a central role in the development of tribal consultation policies, environmental defense strategies, and tribal law and order codes. She's testified before state legislatures, trained federal and state agencies on tribal consultation best practices, and served as an advisor to tribal governments navigating complex jurisdictional landscapes. She's guided multiple Native nations through transformative constitutional reform processes, aligning governance structures with tribal values and principles while reinforcing sovereignty and self-determination. As a scholar, policy strategist, and fierce advocate for tribal rights, Dr. Crystal Miller continues to bridge academia, grassroots advocacy, and high-level policy arenas to advance justice, self-governance, and the inherent rights of Native nations. And we welcome her today as one of our panelists. Our second panelist is Christian Weaver. He's the vice president of Shinnecock Holdings and vice president of philanthropy for Grid Alternatives. Christian's a dynamic leader and seasoned executive known for his strategic foresight and deep commitment to social impact. With over 20 years of experience, he's cultivated a career at the intersection of philanthropy, environmental justice, and Indigenous advocacy. He's the founder and managing director of Shinnecock Power, a venture dedicated to building a sustainable future through renewable energy infrastructure. He also serves as vice president of philanthropy at Grid Alternatives, where he directs multi-million-dollar fundraising initiatives and expands the organization's reach. His leadership journey includes influential roles such as Associate Vice President at the U.S. Soccer Foundation and Vice President of Development for the NCAI, that's the National Congress of American Indians. His foundational experience in organizational growth and resource development was built at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America and the American Indian College Fund. He's a respected thought leader, and he's an alum of the Google Policy Fellowship and a Climate Justice Fellow at the University of Maryland. He has a master's in Indigenous law from the University of Oklahoma and a bachelor's degree from Valdosta State University. He's an engaged member of his tribal community, the Shinnecock Nation. His work is further enriched by his passion for the arts and his personal commitment to philanthropy. He serves on the corporate boards of Shinnecock Sovereign Holdings, Eastwoods Power, and nonprofit boards of the American Indian Cancer Foundation, the Shinnecock Community Fund, and Ma's House. Welcome to you, Christian. Glad you could join us today. Our third panelist is Joseph, who I call Joe McNeil, Chief Executive Officer at SAGE. He's an enrolled citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and he brings both leadership and dedication to his various roles within the community. As the CEO of SAGE Development Authority, which is the federal corporation that does tribal energy development at Standing Rock. He's the CEO of SAGE, and he's also the president as the president of Standing Rock Development Corporation and previous manager for Rock Industries Corp in Fort Yates, North Dakota. He plays a substantial role in driving economic growth and development in the region. Married and a proud father of 4 children, Joe's commitment to his community and his advocacy for Indigenous rights are unwavering. His exceptional leadership qualities have earned him recognition, including the prestigious Bush Foundation Fellowship for his outstanding contributions to the field. He's also a distinguished recipient of the MIT Oceti-Sakowin Fellows Tribal Community Innovation Award. Joe's academic journey led him to earn a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from Sitting Bull College. His commitment to community service is evident in his past roles, including being a former member of the Tribal Council for Standing Rock Sioux and as vice chair of the Sitting Bull College Board. Additionally, his involvement with Wind Energy Tribes United showcases dedication to sustainable energy solutions. At present, Joe serves as the chair of the Oyate Community Development Corporation, where his visionary leadership continues to drive positive change and community development. His multifaceted contributions make him a respected figure in both Indigenous activism and community economic development, embodying the values and aspirations of the Standing Rock Nation. We welcome him today. Finally, we have Jesse Hopkins Hull, who's the Chief Development Officer at Allium Renewable Energy. Jesse is the Chief Development Officer at Allium Renewable Energy, which is an independent power producer based in Chicago, Illinois, where he leads the development of utility-scale wind, solar, and energy storage projects across the United States. With a degree in political science and a minor in community development, Jesse spent over 25 years building bridges between energy innovation and community priorities. His hallmark is a community-first approach that balances marketable, bankable projects with genuine partnerships rooted in trust and shared benefit. That philosophy has fueled Jesse to play a leadership role in the development of 1,000 megawatt in now operational renewable energy facilities and over 4,000 megawatts of projects currently in various stages of development. Raised and rooted in central Minnesota, where he now lives with his wife of 24 years, Jesse finds inspiration both in the beauty of the natural environment and in the strength of local communities. His career has also included service in local government planning, focused on community revitalization and heritage preservation, giving him a unique vantage point on how civic engagement and resource stewardship intersect with large-scale project development. Whether guiding cross-functional teams or navigating complex partnerships with tribal nations and local stakeholders, Jesse is committed to fostering durable relationships, sound project decisions, and lasting community benefits. We're lucky to have all of our very accomplished panelists here today. But before we jump into our discussion with them, we thought it might be useful for those of you listening in to provide a little background about the federal Indian law overlay that impacts tribal energy development projects, particularly because I expect that some of you are not familiar with those things and some of the unique legal concepts that affect tribal energy development. Things like tribal sovereignty, Indian land tenure, corporate structures for tribal businesses, federal approvals, all those things are somewhat unique. To do that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Stephanie Sferitis, who's a counsel in our Native American Law and Policy Group. Steph has extensive experience advising and advocating for Native communities in tribal, state, and federal forums, with a focus on land and realty matters, economic development, and federal acknowledgement. Prior to joining Denton's, she was senior counselor to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at Interior. In this role, she helped lead policy and regulatory work on some of the most high-profile issues in Indian country. She also served as in-house counsel on economic development and other matters for her tribe, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. Steph, if you would please go ahead and give us a little federal Indian law and Indian energy 101 before we start, that would be great. Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Susie, and thank you to everyone who was able to join today. So Susie mentioned tribal energy projects have a unique landscape compared to energy projects that are on non-tribal lands. So we just wanted to give a quick high-level background of what some of these key differences are for tribal energy projects. So I'm going to start with tribal sovereignty. Tribes are sovereign governments that have the inherent right to govern themselves as distinct political entities. And this is rooted in the US Constitution, which recognizes a nation-to-nation relationship between the federally recognized tribes and the federal government. And due to this nation-to-nation relationship, the US also has a legal obligation to tribes. This is known as the Federal Trust Responsibility, and it's a fiduciary obligation to protect treaty rights, lands, assets, and resources. Congress has plenary power over Indian affairs. They can pass federal legislation that affects tribes. So while federal law does affect tribes, state law generally does not apply to tribal lands. Tribes also enjoy sovereign immunity as distinct political entities. That means they generally cannot be sued without issuing a waiver of the sovereign immunity. This immunity also generally extends to entities that are created by the tribe and to tribal officials that are acting in their official capacity. And this is really important when it comes to choosing what business structure the tribe wants to use for their energy project. So there are different structures that have different tax and immunity implications and can affect the transparency for potential investors or partners. So I'm going to run through 3 different structures. One is called a Section 17 corporation. Then there's businesses formed under tribal law, and there's also businesses formed under state law. So Section 17 corporations, those are formed under federal law under the authorities of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. The Indian Reorganization Act, also known as the IRA, was major legislation that dealt with the status of Indians in the US. It marked a major reversal of government policy towards Indian affairs. And part of this act under Section 17, it authorized tribes to equip themselves with the devices of modern business organizations and form tribal business corporations. And so these business corporations that are formed under the IRA are known as Section 17 corporations. These are wholly owned by the tribe, but they are distinct from the tribal government. There's no federal income taxes that are paid. It does preserve tribal assets, and these corporations can also issue tax exempt bonds for certain purposes. One of the complications of an IRA Section 17 corporation is that the corporate charter can't be dissolved or suspended except by an act of Congress. It also cannot be amended without approval from the Secretary at the Department of the Interior. The second type of corporation is a tribally chartered corporation. So this would be formed pursuant to a tribal code or a resolution. It's essentially tribal law that would be passed at the tribal government level. It does not require federal approval. It likely will avoid state regulation and taxation. There can be potential implications with sovereign immunity depending on the structure and makeup of the corporation. There's also state chartered corporations. So those are businesses that are owned by the tribe that are filed under state law. They're pretty easy to form because states have their own process in place already for forming corporations. There's transparency as to the filings because all of that information is usually required to be online in the state database. There's no presumption of sovereign immunity in these types of corporations. They also must pay federal taxes, and there's potential state tax liability. So again, there's 3 different structures to choose from, and there's, depending on your project, different reasons for choosing different structures. There's also different types of land tenures in Indian country. So there's Indian reservations. However, there's different types of lands within those reservations, and those can determine the approvals and requirements that are needed for an energy project. So a few different types of the land. So there's trust land. Those are lands where the government actually holds the title to land for the tribe. There is restricted fee land. That is where the tribe or an individual holds title, but the land is restricted from alienation, meaning it can't be sold off without approval of the secretary. And then there's also allotted lands. So those lands were divided and given to individuals. But as these allotments were taken out of trust, they became subject to state and local taxation, which resulted in essentially thousands of acres passing out of Indian hands into the hands of non-Indian owners, which means that they are sometimes held in fee status. There can also be many interests within one of those parcels, and can include fee status interests within those parcels. So the land tenure can get somewhat complicated. On top of the land tenure, there's also other approvals that are needed. So for example, leases and rights of ways are commonly used in tribal energy projects for transmission lines and such. And when those are on tribal lands, they require certain secretarial approvals, meaning from the Secretary of the Department of the Interior. And again, that's because of that federal trust responsibility and the unique government-to-government relationship that tribes have with the US. So there are restrictions governing how many years leases can be entered into. It's generally 25 years. Leases require secretarial approval before issuing them. There are different ways around that. There's something called the Helping Expedite and Advance Responsible Tribal Home Ownership Act from 2012. It's commonly known as the Hearth Act. It provides a more efficient, streamlined leasing process for tribes. So the way that works is tribes can submit tribal leasing regulations to be approved by the Secretary of the Interior. And then once those are approved, tribes are able to authorized to negotiate and enter into surface leases under those approved regulations without any further approval from the Department of the Interior. The regulations have to be consistent with the BIA leasing regs. The BIA is the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior, who has authority over pretty much all things Indian Affairs at Interior. They have their own sets of regulations for leasing. a tribe doing Hearth Act regulations would have to be consistent with those leasing regs. But they can include leases for wind and solar. And again, this can reduce the time to execute and approve leases because you don't need continual approval from the Secretary of the Interior. I also mentioned rights of ways. So rights of ways on reservations, they can cross both trust and allotted lands. Those require different levels of approval. So you have rights of ways on trust or restricted fee lands. Those require approval from the BIA. There's generally a 50-year term limit to a right of way for an individual landowner. There could be a little bit more discretion for lands that the tribe holds. It also requires compensation for landowners to meet fair market value. That's all within the rights of way regulations at the Department of the Interior. But if there's rights of ways that are crossing fee interests within a parcel, those actually do not require BIA approval. So this type of different land tenure holdings can lead to really complicated scenarios when there's checkerboarding on a reservation. And checkerboarding in a reservation means that there are both trust and fee parcels within the reservation. And if the right of way has to cross both of those trust and fee parcels, you might need approvals from the government for certain rights of ways, but no approvals from the government for other rights of ways, but you still need rights of ways to cover all of that land. There's also, it can get even more complex if there are these allotted lands that we talked about within the space that the right of way will cross. If there's fee ownership interests within a percentage of that parcel, and sometimes there are multiple fee interests within a parcel, there could require, several different right of ways with several different owners just for that one parcel. The other thing I wanted to touch on really quick is just further complications right now at the current time for wind and solar projects based on current administration priorities. So on July 15th, the Department of the Interior released a memo requiring final review by the Office of the Secretary for nearly all actions related to wind and solar projects. This is pretty significant, and that's because, so for normal protocol for all of these approvals that I just mentioned, the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs would have the authority to approve the actions on tribal land, so like rights of ways, leases, things like that. And that's because that authority is delegated from the Secretary of the Interior down to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. But now, according to this memo, nearly every step related to wind and solar energy projects, so things like environmental actions, rights of way applications and grants, leases, rights of ways on tribal lands, and a bunch of other actions, they can no longer just be approved by the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, but they need to go through the Office of Interior Secretary Burgum, who oversees the entire department. And so this is really going to lead to significant delays for any actions falling within the scope of the memo, which seems to be nearly every step related to wind and solar projects. So it's a really, really quick, high-level primer on Indian affairs and tribal energy projects. But all of this to say, these projects are not impossible. These are just unique factors to take into account. And again, compounded by this interior memo, specifically targeting wind and solar projects. So our panelists are going to talk more about how some of these factors play out in real life scenarios for tribal energy projects, but hopefully this background was helpful.
Thanks, Steph. As you all can probably see, there are a number of unique things that go along with tribal energy projects. We're going to start our discussion with the panelists talking to Joe McNeil about the Enpetui wind farm that the Standing Rock Sioux tribe is trying to develop out there on the reservation. This particular project has dealt with many of the things Steph talked about. The Sage Corporation is a Section 17 corporation. We've got rights of way, we've got leases. There are multiple owners of many of these pieces of land. Some are state, fee owners within the reservation. So, Sage and Standing Rock is dealing with a number of these issues right now. So, Joe, if you would not mind, would you give us a little bit of background about your experience as the CEO of the Sage Development Corporation and development of the Ampetui Wind Farm? Some of the issues that you've had to deal with and what the current
Mhm.
status is and that sort of stuff.
Great. Well, thank you, Susie. It's been great to work with. I just need to say this up front. It's been great to work with Denton's, as a partner, for all of our legal work and guidance in DC, interconnecting, the issues that we're dealing with and coming to solutions in a timely way when we're developing a commercial scale wind farm for Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. And also want to give applause to Stephanie there, for laying out the groundwork, if you will, for a lot of the definitions that tribes have to deal with in regard to trying to develop energy assets and any assets on federal lands that the tribes are existing on currently due to the treaties and also due to the recognition of tribal sovereign states within the United States. So the Ampetui Wind Farm was created by the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. After the 2016 No DAPL protests we had a lot of philanthropy come in and ask the tribe, in particular, the governance at the time, what can we do to help Standing Rock? And we've had this project on paper for like the last 20 years, where we have done a couple exploratory endeavors. We put an RFP out. We had about 6 major wind developers come in and talk about developing our wind, but it ended up just looking like a land lease deal for all of the projects that were being proposed of by all of the developers in the space. And we said at the time that, and I sat on council then, that is not beneficial to the tribe because we didn't have any real ownership or revenue generation from our wind. And we had just put that on the back burner. So we took the opportunity in 2016, 17, when the protest was going on, to reinvest into our endeavor about looking at how do we develop this Section 17 into a development arm that can be fully independent, that can reduce the risk for investors, and that's what a Section 17 does. It is, in essence, an LLC for the tribe. So it doesn't put the tribal assets at risk, any of the land, any of the debt. All are owned by the Section 17 organization. So our tribe moved forward into creating this organization that was ratified in 2020 to move forward with the development of the Ampetui Wind Farm. So we're developing 235 megawatts, and the only reason it's limited to that capacity, we have about 400 megawatts we could develop in the area, is because of the size of the interconnection to sell our power commercially. And those are the large KV lines that travel through all of the states, to this intricate web of energy transportation from points of generation to points of consumption. So we've been engaged in some power purchase agreement discussions with large corporations for the last 5 to 6 years, and they've been very helpful in our development of our strategy and how do we move forward in the space, and then also how do we interconnect. And so we've been a part of an interconnection agreement with the Southwestern Power Pool, which governs all of the power and transmission generation from Montana, North Dakota, all the way down to Oklahoma, where that was piecemealed out before separately by states and regions. Now you have your large ISOs. You have Southwestern Power Pool, which we're involved in, and then Midwestern MISO, just adjacent to us on the east side of the Missouri River, which is the Midwest Interconnection Service Organization. I forget what the acronym is. So we have been involved in the interconnection queue study with Southwestern Power Pool, and we have, as a tribe, didn't have the resources to put into a lot of the application fees and then the service studies that go along with that, and encountered pretty quickly that it's a deposits that go along with all of the studies are quite arduous. And so we've been doing a lot of philanthropic campaigning, if you will, initially by the folks who had come to assist us, if you will, in the beginning. And how do we broaden that pool to fund our needs in the deposit queue studies, as those things we found out can multiply and double and triple with 20 days notice. So all said and done, we've been in the Southwestern Interconnection queue study for about 4 years. We have about $5.6 million invested into the queue studies, and we're coming to the end of that phase, approaching our generator interconnection agreement. Now, the cost can escalate, depending on what the queue study says and how many projects are impacted on the transmission lines at a certain given time within a queue study group. So each year another study group is formed, and they have a certain set of rules that they abide by, and how those projects affects other projects coming on the line with the size and scope available that they're attempting to put on the lines, and then also the cost of upgrading the systems and the substations that are associated with putting power onto those lines. Those projects are responsible for. So our interconnection queue expenses have gone from where our project is located to the point of interconnection, and then that point of interconnection affecting the rest of the line. Our queue study interconnection costs have gone from $26 million initially when we began this process about 4.5 years ago. And then a couple of years ago, we had to move our project due to environmental studies and sacred sites. We wanted to avoid all sacred sites, which is important for tribes to respect the land and the places of worship where we pray. Also, the environment, because we don't just live as human beings with the world, we live with all of our relatives, those that crawl, fly, swim, grow, everything that we consider a relative, protecting of our environment for our future generations. So as we've adjusted and shifted our project, we're in a location now where we're primarily in agricultural fields and have leased a significant amount of fee land. I think Stephanie was touched on that in particular, but fee land is owned privately within a reservation boundary and governed by the state. So we've come into options. We've leased a significant amount of option leases and fee lands, and then working with the BIA on our allotted and tribal lands, because the tribe has significant interest or percentage of interest control for the tribal lands in the space. So this project will not just generate revenue from the electricity generation, but also land lease for the tribe and also fee in lieu of taxes for the tribe. So it'll be 3 streams of revenue for the tribe by this project. So all that to say, we've been very much involved in trying to maintain our ownership through the space. We've come to, we believe, I think it's the first of its kind for a tribal wind project of this size, is a developer services agreement with a major developer, Steelhead, who develops projects for Vestas, and one of the top 3 developers in the world. Well, let's say top 5 developers in the world. And it's a developer services agreement, so they didn't buy our project outright, so we maintain ownership. So it's important for us to consider when we began the project to where we are now to maintain ownership so that we can maintain maximum revenue generation and come through this process and the schedule and the timelines to keep faith with our investors, to keep the project on schedule, and to move forward through the intergenerator connection agreement to the GIA to put our costs in a snapshot in time to freeze them so that we can move forward into construction financing. Some things have extended the timelines out. The new administration has its priorities, and those priorities are at odds, if you will. Like Stephanie was explaining, the federal implications that Department of Interior is putting for permitting, are something that we need to strategize about so that we can stay on schedule. It's important for us. So we did go visit Burgum personally to have this conversation with him, and he said, yes, this is important for Standing Rock to have a third leg of revenue. It's important for us to hold them to account for those things in that space, and or work with like folks to ensure that the communities, particularly Native nations, can build the projects that we need to sustain not just our ability to survive, but to thrive economically for our people's independence, and for our economy's development in the future. I'm sorry, I can really travel on in a lot of different ways in this conversation. We've been very busy for the last 4 years. We've been primarily funded through philanthropy, a certain level of federal grants, and a lot of real just boots on the ground, getting it done by our tribe. So I want to take my hat off to my tribe in particular for thinking about the Section 17 and enacting it so that we reduce our volatility as we go through election cycles, that our board of directors maintains its strategy and alignment moving forward with a lot of the other organizations that we've come into contact with, not just regionally, but nationally, that have alignment in the way that we're doing this project and the purposes and goals that it serves.
Thank you, Joe. That's a good snapshot of the many
It's a mouthful.
Joe has to deal with a lot of different things going on with the project, and it's it is challenging, but they're doing a great job and we love working with them. I think now, why don't we turn to Jesse and let him talk a little bit about some of Allium Energy's experiences working with tribes. Jesse, if you could just kind of give us a brief description about what does Allium Renewable Energy do? How did you get involved working with tribes? And maybe a little comparison between non-tribal and tribal utility scale projects.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Susie. I would like to echo Joe's comments. We are tremendously grateful for our experience with Denton's and the help that you guys have provided us, Susie, and your team. So thank you very much. And Joe, congratulations. You've accomplished a tremendous amount. It's sing to the choir here I very much understand most of what you were describing with our work. Allium Renewable Energy is a privately held utility scale renewable energy development, execution, construction, and operations team based in Chicago. We've been in existence since the late 2000s. I personally lead the development team as the chief development officer. We find ourselves in a very unique and fortunate position to have a much smaller wind project nearing construction at this stage. It's about 65 megawatts, about 17 wind turbines in Oklahoma with a partnership with a couple of tribes there, the Kaw and the Otoe Missouri tribes. Back in 2000, in the late 2000s, the local tribes had basically won a feasibility grant from the Department of Energy for the purposes of exploring development opportunities on their tribal trust lands. That allowed them to do a couple of things. One, put up a meteorological tower to measure the wind resource in the area. And then two, to reach out into the industry, which is how we became introduced to them at that time. They reached in to Allium. At the time, it was PNE USA. But we worked through a process to establish leases and a partnership with the local tribes, and they essentially suggested that somebody from their community could participate with us and really essentially act as a facilitator who we ended up hiring into our team, and currently work with them still today. The complexity, I mean, Stephanie's description just reminds me, and how complex this environment working through, tribal sovereignty issues, tribal lands, the complexity of the checkerboarding. And, we just put one foot in front of the other and work the issues of the day in order to kind of work through those. But they each have their kind of unique processes to get through. I think for us, we find working with tribal entities and tribal nations to be, I want to say, somewhat refreshing, because it brings me back to where I started. Community development, is it unique? It definitely is, and we have to understand the interests, and each tribe's interests are different. Their participation capabilities or desires are different depending on who we're talking to. And I guess for me, that's where I start. If we begin with understanding, partnership, and a working diplomacy, that sets us off on the right foot to work together, explore together, plan together, win together. In the current environment, that's very challenging. There's a lot of impediments right now to that. I'll say normal course of business, but for me, it's very rewarding, and working through some of these sovereignty issues, for example, it breathes new life into learning how to work in this industry. We have this project and several other projects that we're working on with tribal entities, and I just want to give a shout out to the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy Projects, because that has been extremely informative to me and my team, to socialize that amongst the team and essentially step off on the right foot.
Thank you, Jesse. That's great to hear, and we're thrilled to work with you, and really glad you're working with the tribes in Oklahoma. Why don't we drill down a little bit more now on some of the questions about financing, support, and how tribal energy sovereignty kind of intersects with the federal government's role. I'm going to turn to Christian and Crystal for that. Christian, why don't we start off with you giving us maybe your views on, what does tribal energy sovereignty mean for Shinnecock, for, your tribe, and your thoughts on how corporate American philanthropy can kind of help, can be better allies for the tribal energy sector.
Sure. Thanks, Suzanne. So for those that don't know, I'm a citizen of the Shinnecock Tribal Nation. We are a tribe located on the eastern end of Long Island in New York. We've been on our territory for over 15,000 years. And we are surrounded by what is now the Hamptons, so Southampton, East Hampton, West Hampton, Montauk. And there's an interesting juxtaposition of social class and wealth between the folks that live in and among the Hamptons and the tribal people of Long Island. For comparison, the average income for a person living on Shinnecock tribal territory is somewhere around $33,000 a year, compared to those who are living in around Southampton. I think it's maybe like 1.5 million is the average income. So stark comparison. And the energy disparities are also very stark, right? The energy bills are high, regardless if you're living on territory or off territory. But if your average income is 1.5 million, it's a lot easier for you to stomach that high energy burden versus if you're making $33,000 a year. It's a big chunk out of your paycheck, right? And and we know that over the history of this continent, of North America, well, from Canada all the way down, through Central South America, we have retained our own energy sovereignty, right? So we have been the experts, indigenous people have been the experts in understanding how energy works and how energy fuels various parts of our communities and allows us to sustain. We have been the experts and still are the experts when it comes to sustainability in our communities. And with the industrial complex, that power and that the ability for us to showcase our expertise has been removed from us, and also our energy sovereignty has been attacked. And so at Shinnecock, we're trying to retain our energy sovereignty. We have a number of subject matter experts in sustainability, environmentalism, and in the energy sector. And what we're trying to do is do a couple of things. One, mitigate the high energy costs for our community, our tribal community, using renewable energy infrastructure, but also showcase our ability to provide renewable energy infrastructure to the surrounding communities, right? So we want to also not only support our community, but the folks that are living around Long Island around this infrastructure. It's very difficult for indigenous people to leverage financing to do our work. We're often overlooked when it comes to engaging with financial institutions to develop projects. As a matter of fact, so some scientists believe that indigenous people around the world protect about 60 to 80% of the world's biodiversity. These stats are a little bit debated depending on what scientists you talk to, but they generally believe that 60 to 80% of biodiversity in the world are protected by indigenous peoples. In the United States, less than 1%. So, and I think the stat is about between 0.5 and 0.6% of funding from financial institutions in the form of grants go to Indian country. So not even 1% of funding from financial institutions, or corporate foundations reach Indian country, which is a big problem, right? And so what we're trying to do is to educate and work with funders and say, hey, we indigenous people, in particular in the United States, we hold the keys to really changing the landscape of our community, our environment, and the sustainability in the United States. We need you to work with us and support us in doing that and fund our endeavors, right? And there's a number of ways that you can do that, but this has been a trend for decades upon decades in the United States. Actually, only 20% of large funders give to Native organizations or tribal organizations, and so that's not even half. So we have some work to do. A big reason for that problem is the fact that our stories are not lifted up. Right. So funders do not think of tribal communities when they think of sustainability, when they think of energy experts, when they think of other issues going on. We are often forgotten because our stories are buried and our memories are silenced. So we have some work to do to lift up our stories so that we're landing on the desks of the funders and the folks making decisions. Bridgespan actually put out a great report and a great study of how funders can better engage with tribal communities and tribal businesses. And they listed a couple of things, one of which is reciprocity. They recommend that funders share and receive resources and knowledge with Native peoples in a way that embodies exchange between all parties. They also suggest making funding decisions in a way that is accountable for Native communities, share power and decision-making with Native communities, and influence processes and structures that will direct funding to Native leaders. One of the things I've seen from a number of funders, and I hope this trend continues, is for funders to hire and employ Native people to direct their Native grant making, right? And that's vitally important. So if you don't have someone from a Native community directing your tribal grant making, you might not be doing it in the best way. We want to encourage best practices, and so hiring folks from communities to lead in the grant making and lead in the funding, whether those maybe it's impact dollars that are going out, but engaging with tribal folks to help steward, direct, and coach institutions on the best practices of disseminating funds into our communities, I think will be super impactful. So those are some of the things that that I recommend, and I know other folks in the industry are recommending as we continue to evolve and try to retain our energy sovereignty within tribal communities. The work that Joe is doing at Sage is remarkable and is a great blueprint on ways that funders should be working with tribes. Also really appreciate the work that the Alliance is doing as well. Shinnecock is working directly with the Alliance, and they have a Weaver program. They didn't name it after me, but it's a really cool program that allows tribal energy businesses to go through their Weaver model and build a bridge between the tribes and funding opportunities as well. So I'll pause there and pass the mic over to Crystal. I think you might have some questions for her.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Crystal. I know you're going to have a lot to say about these issues. And I just wanted to, let you talk more about, strategies for tribes to overcome structural barriers to financing, and also the question about, asserting tribal sovereignty when you've got to deal with kind of the federal overlay and often delay in kind of asserting tribal interests. So I'll let you go for it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump right in, and without reiterating a lot of the great things that everybody has already said, maybe I'll jump into a little bit of examples. But one thing that I want to say overarchingly is that when we think about tribal sovereignty and energy, it must be understood as not a request. We're not requesting for it to be included in federal state processes, because it's a right that tribes have to govern and decide how development occurs on their own tribal lands. Despite that knowledge, that tribes are inherently sovereign. We've been sovereign before America was America. We've been sovereign before 1492, and we'll continue to be sovereign for 1,000 years moving forward. Despite all of that knowledge, we have had a history of paternalism where we've seen the federal government come in incrementally and continue to push oversight of tribes and how tribes make decisions, much like Stephanie had given us that great overview earlier about. And we've seen it in a lot of different areas under NEPA. We've seen it in the Federal Power Act, and we've even seen it in state siting laws. And so one of the things that the Alliance does, in particular my policy team, is we look at all of those structure barriers where they're trying to implement more paternalism, and we look at different ways and different avenues that we can, either through legislative avenues or regulatory avenues, to kind of push back and reinstitute sovereignty. Because one of the things that we do in our policy shop is look at, first and foremost, how can we protect sovereignty in the things that we're going to do and advocate for, or how can we expand sovereignty in the process of doing that? Now, I know under this administration, it seems really difficult. We're getting a lot of things rescinded. However, for me, I'm very optimistic. When I see those things rescinded, I always have these conversations with tribes and tell them that this is the opportunity. Oh, they're removing environmental protections? Then codify your own. Adopt energy plans, and so that way you have regulatory measures on how things are going to move forward and within your own jurisdiction. One of the examples that I'll move into kind of what Christian was talking about was FERC Order 2023, and that's one that we've been really working on over the last year. So Order number 2023 from FERC mandated that all interconnection queue applicants exhibit their commitment to constructing a proposed generating facility by paying a commercial readiness deposit. And that deposit was extremely steep, and really it was to remove speculation from large developers And this is what Joe had touched on. It was to remove speculation on large developers who were entering to the queue because they had the capital to do so, or there wasn't a requirement then, but they were entering into the queue and then had no desire to finish projects. So they were really just taking up space and then pulling out. So they instituted this order, which was good, but then going back to what Christian had said, they didn't think about tribes in the process, and in the process, tribes got swept up. So after Order 2023 was implemented, tribes were now being hit with a large multi-million dollar, almost sometimes $5 to $7 million security deposit. And Joe can speak to a much higher number for their security deposit that tribes just don't have the access to capital to put forward as a security deposit. So we had worked with a tribe in Arizona who was battling with this interconnection queue security deposit. And they had turned around and said, yes, you can enter into the queue. We have a spot for you, but you're gonna have to pay $5 to $7 million. Well, they didn't have the $5 to $7 million. So they came to the Alliance and we asked, and they had asked us to assist them with locating the $5 to $7 million. And it was a very difficult process, but we did. We located the $5 to $7 million. There was a tribe in Southern California who assisted to put up the money up front. And when we took it to them and we told them, well, we found the money, they can enter into the queue now. They turned around and said, we are so happy that you found the $5 to $7 million. However, it's the wrong kind of money. So then we figured, you know, as the Alliance, we can't do this for every single tribe who's being hit with this imposed regulation and this imposed rule from the federal government every single time they want to enter into the queue. And so we kind of swam upstream and said, you know what, we're just going to petition to change the rule. And so we had a lot of arguments around, you know, the institution of that new order as it pertains to tribes is not culturally relevant. Tribes are sovereign governments. They should be making their own decisions. And monetary capital should not be the premise on which a tribe proves that they're ready to move forward with the project. We have other things as sovereign entities like resolutions that we move forward with. And then also the fact that a lot of these projects are stacked with multiple federal grants that also constitute the readiness that they're really looking for. And so that's one of the examples that we really looked at and said, you know what, they're imposing rules on tribes that are really hindering their process and kind of furthermore practicing the historical practice that we've seen of the exclusion from the energy market by doing things that are just non-culturally relevant. Another thing that is really high priority for us right now, and thank you, Stephanie, for hitting on it, is the DOI memo from July 15th. It reinstitutes that historical practice that we're trying to get away from by reinforcing the paternalism that tribes have to answer to the federal government when pursuing energy projects, particularly this one around solar and wind. And so the things that we've been doing is we've been working really close with Congress. We've been working really close with the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and then the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources to really push on the Department of Interior to clarify that tribes should not be swept up in the memo. We're not asking for the memo to be fully rescinded, but because of the sovereign aspect and the inherent right for tribes to govern themselves on their own lands is the premise on which we're really pushing to get that clarification around that. And so those are some of the most relevant and prime examples that we have on all of the things that we've been talking about and really looking at protecting and expanding sovereignty in the process where the federal government is not imposing on it and really allowing tribes to make their own decisions. As Christian had mentioned earlier, you know, we've been leading this space for so long. And on top of that, not to mention that tribes generally across the board look at themselves as inherently tied to the land. And so there's always that responsibility to protect the land. Now, energy is a natural resources, which also ties directly into that as well, too. And so really looking at that, one of the things that that I guess I would leave you with outside of what I've already mentioned in terms of the examples is for the partners that we work with. I think it's really important for all of us to understand that the tribes that we're working with, that they understand their priorities, because every tribe's going to be different. It's not a one size fit all box. And I think that's really why we are where we are now, is because it is easier for one entity, which I guess I'd call that one entity, the federal government, to make a cookie cutter, but that cookie cutter really doesn't fit for what Joe needs in his nation, and it doesn't really fit for what I need in my nation, and it doesn't really fit fully for what Christian needs in his nation. And so we're really looking at piecing things that may or may not fit versus really truly working with the tribes that we're partnering with, and or maybe the lands that we're building on. It doesn't really fit for their landscape. And so really the last thing that I suggest is truly getting to understand the tribes that you're working with.
Thank you, Crystal. Those are all great comments, and thank you for working on trying to push back on that July memo because, Steph mentioned that, it's instead of having, generally those approval authorities are with the assistant secretary. They're not, I mean, really, it's delegated down to the region. So normally we would need to get approval from the regional BIA, not for obviously the Hearth Act lease approvals, but for all the other ones. And, having this going all the way up to the secretary for approval is going to really, I mean, I don't know what staff are even going to be there to do it, once the government's not shut down anymore. It's really, adding a lot of federal oversight that, is not kind of, as you mentioned, not really appropriate and not definitely not going to help us in trying to get the Standing Rock project moving. Joe, did you want to say anything about that in particular? Because we've been working on, letters to the secretary to ask for an exemption from the memo as well.
Right. And I know I just sent you an email about this. I think it was yesterday. It's like we need to re-up on our letters demanding accountability for the decisions that aren't being announced. That tribal nations are going to be, I don't want to say this, tribal nations are like Crystal just said, in a paternalistic sense that we must ask for permission to develop our own resources, to take care of our own selves and our own sovereign rights to exist. And we are, like anyone else, is looking to take care of ourselves and do not want to be under the yoke, if you will, of the federal government for every decision that we make on our own lands. And it is critical I think, for everyone to understand that when we make a decision on our lands, it is for 7 generations and beyond, to take care of that for our future generations. And as we look at the exploitation of the energy resources in the country, everyone else is being brought into this scope of being affected due to the climate crisis and the carbon in the environment, due to the weather patterns changing. We're all coming into this situation where we must recognize what the decisions for the last 100 years have brought us to. And so back to DOI and our state, like we're in North Dakota, South Dakota, very red states, but some of these senators have projects that are being affected by this and are starting to push back. So for us, it's getting to a position where we're aligning with some of those senators and back to local and regional alignments, away from federal, so that we can get some support there to be able to push our projects forward. But it really, to me, comes down to sovereignty and our treaties and how we move forward in that space without being hamstrung by the government, for the use of our lands as we're responsible, practicing protections of the environment and making sure that we're doing these things in a good way that I think exemplify how this needs to be done in the future. So it's really and it's fortunate for us to have people in development and legal and in allied circles, like the Alliance and other organizations that are working around these discussions and working around who because sometimes it's not what you know. Most times it's not what you know, it's who you know and the relationships that you have and you carry to be able to move a lot of these issues that each tribe has forward in their energy journeys and how that's achieved. If it weren't for grants and philanthropy, And then also creatively working in philanthropy, like donor advised funds, getting aligned with folks who are looking to, that don't mind getting a smaller interest rate on their loans back, and then having that go to the communities, I think is a way forward for not just tribal nations, but communities overall writ large that can organize themselves to take care of themselves, if you will. And then also PRIs, you know, from different foundations and philanthropies have been very helpful. What they're experiencing now, and we're hoping that they hold water to, is to not hold back and withdraw, but to take a step forward and move forward in providing more funds to the communities and projects that they've supported over the last 4 years during the Biden administration. Not to make this political, but you know, move forward in that way so these projects can continue, you know, through the waves, you know, of politics as we're dealing with it. So there are a lot of different things that are being utilized, like our projects are utilizing, and it's just communicating that out to other folks so that these relationships can be shared with other projects that might be looking at this type of situation as halting their projects and halting their endeavors.
Suzanne, and if I could jump in really quickly.
Yes, please.
Just because Joe really mentioned something that kind of turned the light on, and I apologize for not mentioning it. So Christian had mentioned the Weaver platform that the Alliance has for financial projects and capital stack. One of the things that the Alliance also has as well too, that I know that other orgs are setting up, is a philanthropic fund. And so we have the Indigenous Power and Light Fund, and it's a $100 million fund, and it's supposed to be designed mostly for grants. But it has also moved into loans because we have seen over the last couple of months that what we originally thought was going to be gap funding for maybe pre-feasibility or other early stages of development kind of turned into, oh, well, you know, grants were rescinded, so we need larger funds. And so it has pivoted slightly, but all of that is funded through philanthropy. And I know other organizations are setting them up as well too. And so that is maybe a solution that we're kind of looking to in the future.
That's great to know. Thank you, Crystal. Why don't Christian, actually all of panelists, what else, what's missing out there to allow tribal energy projects to kind of keep moving and be developed and move forward, you know, to actually completion and, producing power? What kind of things do we think would be helpful, whether from the federal government or whoever?
It's a great question. I think there's a number of things that can really catapult energy Indian country forward. We've got some good momentum starting. Tribes are starting to as we see and as we know, start to develop energy infrastructure. But we're running through some hurdles. I think cross collaboration and unity is very important. Shinnecock, under our Section 17 and under Shinnecock Power, have developed a tribal energy development organization at TITO. And we've done that to build a business infrastructure that allows us to collaborate with other tribal entities and work together to build and develop large projects. I think that there's a lot of other collaboration and best practices that can be had. So I think convenings where tribal folks, tribal leaders and energy developers can come together and build on best practices is really could be really special and needed. We see that in other markets and in other industries, whether that's the law industry or the gaming industry or other things. I think we need the same for the energy industry. And then finally, a lot of what we've already discussed today is tribal, our seat at the table being vacated so we can sit at it. Right now, the seats at the table are being sat in by folks that are not tribal. And as a matter of fact, I went to New York Climate Week a few weeks ago, And I did the round of panels and events. Very little, very few events had tribal leaders sitting on a panel and leading those discussions. I was honored to be able to attend one where Joe was on a panel, but by and large, outside of the Native specific events, there weren't tribal leaders that were invited to sit on these panels and hold these discussions and lead the discussions. And I think that's very important, is that we need more opportunities for our tribal leaders to sit on panels and lead discussions around energy infrastructure in the United States. So I'll pause there and allow my colleagues to chime in.
Thank you, Chris. Let me hop in there. Thank you for coming to that panel. It was great to see a familiar face at Climate Week. It's always good to see Chris in these spaces. And I really appreciate that he puts himself out there, to represent tribal nations, not just Shinnecock, but he represents like everyone when he's out there. He does a fantastic job as an ambassador for our voices. But some things that I think that could help tribes, going back to DOI and BIA, is trust land facilitation at the BIA. We know that during this administration's push to get everybody retired and out the door, that reduced capacity in a lot of the local offices and regional offices to facilitate leasing right-of-ways. But another thing that keeps crossing my mind is that fee land owners use their lands to leverage loans. So that would be very helpful for tribes to be able to leverage the fee land, leverage the trust land assets in the same like way, because they're being held in trust. So it's a double-edged sword. One, it's being held in trust, so it's protected from abusive investors, if you will, people looking to use the tribe, et cetera. But on the other side, it constricts the tribes to be able to leverage their land as you would, and take it to a bank, for loans, for economic development across the board. That would be extremely helpful for DOI to take a look at that assessment of the limitations that hold tribes back. That for me is a big key.
And then just jumping right in to kind of bring all of that full circle, I think going back to the conversation that we had when we talked about jurisdictional complexities and really getting into the weeds of that. But there are jurisdictional complexities in Indian country, and it stems from the historical overlap of the federal, state, and local authorities that have fractured tribal decision-making over land and energy development just historically. And because most lands are held in trust, or this checkerboard that we have continuously talked about with mixed ownership, any one single project can trigger multiple, often conflicting reviews, much like we had talked about approvals or reviews from the BIA or DOE, or FERC has to look at something, or maybe it's a state utility regulator who has to look at something. And all of those undermine sovereignty and delay clean energy development for tribal projects. And so when we look at what could be a possible solution, some of the things that we've talked about in the past is maybe restoring the primary tribal jurisdiction through mechanisms like tribal energy sovereignty compacts, or maybe it's like a federal delegation agreement that recognizes tribal permitting as legally sufficient and binding. And so really looking at those approaches to streamline approvals and uphold that federal trust and treaty responsibility that we continuously talk about. And in the long run, it's going to allow tribes to regulate their own energy futures. That's going to be consistent with their laws, because we did talk about them codifying their own laws and regulations. It's going to be consistent with their values, because we know that tribes are going to always protect their own land and their environment. And then also it's going to develop their priorities well into the future.
So right now, one of the questions we talked about, Crystal, that you had about, future leaders, tribal youth, trying to get them, prepared to help manage and expand tribal energy projects rather than, relying on developers and consultants. And, what Standing Rock is doing is pretty unique in that aspect. But do you have anything else you wanted to say about that? Kind of looking to the future.
Yeah, I actually made a list for this one because this one's really important. So Joe had mentioned earlier that we have this 7 generation thinking, and that's pretty consistent. Maybe it's not 7 generations because, you know, it'll change from tribe to tribe because we're not all the same. But we're always thinking about the kids that we haven't even met yet. And so with that knowledge, we have to think about the things that we're building today has to be sustainable for them, knowing that this is what they're going to inherit. And so we either do the work today or we hand off the work to them, and that's not something that we're willing to compromise. And so I have a list of things that are suggestive. And so one of the things that I put down was to really look at establishing tribal youth energy councils. So I know that some tribes have youth councils that really look at the governmental aspect, but I don't know if I've seen one that's specific to energy councils. Knowing that when you look at all the things that we do from a tribal government in a holistic view, it touches energy in everything that we do. Regardless if it's education, touches energy, governance touches energy, looking at language revitalization now touches energy. And so really is a key priority for us to really look at that. And so establishing a tribal youth energy council was a very high priority. Also embed clean energy into tribal education pipelines. And so how can we look at educational curriculums that maybe are tribal schools, or maybe it's our TCUs that are teaching, and really weave it in, knowing that it is a high priority, and really looking at, even if it's an environmental justice class, or maybe it's an environmental class or a science class, because we're in the K through 12 system, how are we beginning to implement and bridge and bring that conversation of energy into the fold. And then also mentorship programs. Yesterday, I had a conversation with somebody actually from Red Lake, and they said, I became a mentor and I don't even know how. And it's because they're doing the energy work. And because of the understanding in their tribal nation that energy is extremely important. And so implementing and embedding mentorship into tribal nations, and even with partnerships in our partners that are non-native, that are developers that we're working with, whatever the case may be, really bridging that gap and bringing that into the fold.
Can I also jump in here on this
Yeah.
question? I love all Crystal's answers. I also would like to lift up GRID's Tribal Energy organization, T, Tribal Energy Alternatives, as a great resource for building a bridge for young people into the sector. So our tribally led organization, T, has a workforce development pipeline in which they have multitudes of curriculums. We have a scholarship program. We have a 11-month-long fellowship program. Actually, that Fawn Sharp, the former president of NCAI, is currently a fellow in our program. And we have internships with amazing companies and organizations. And so GRID is really trying to build this pipeline for tribal people into the energy sector. And we're trying to meet that at different levels of their career. One of the things that Crystal brought up was TCUs. We're also we've designed a curriculum for TCUs and are partnering with a number of TCUs to train students in the energy sector. One of our favorite TCUs is the College of Menominee Nation. They actually have a sustainability institute up there that are doing remarkable things. Lummi Community College up in Washington also does really remarkable things around solar energy, and GRID has partnered with them on a number of projects. So I agree with everything that Crystal said. I think that the future is our young people, and as we continue to foster their careers, making sure that we're embedding them into these internships, fellowships, and other programs, I think is going to be very vital. Also want to give a shout out to my friends over at ACES. They also offer a lot of opportunities for folks in the STEM field, and just do a remarkable job of providing opportunities for young people to get into the energy space. So, yeah.
I'd like to jump in just for a second too. From my perspective, and I think it's unique, and on this panel, I'm very appreciative for participation in it. And I think one of the things that I found beneficial with our relationship with the project in Oklahoma is the ability to process those hearth transitions. And so to the extent that something can be done to meet today's opportunities for that seems to be one of the standout opportunities that we had to have some experience with and are ready to kind of work into the market to help partner with tribes. I think if we the opportunity with the data centers, the growing load, there's just a tremendous amount of opportunity for all sorts of resources to hit the market, but renewable energy is in a unique spot from an interconnection perspective to meet the load requirements in the very immediate future. Renewable energy projects have the dominant position in those interconnection queues and are the projects that are most ready to hit our energy needs. And in order to do that, we really need to streamline, self-governance and working through the leasing opportunities that do exist and trying to cut through some of the red tape.
Yeah, and Jesse, on that point, the Hearth Act that Steph talked about earlier basically, allows tribes to process their own energy leases. If the tribe has enacted one of those, why don't we have something like that for rights of way? There are a lot of things like that where I'm not sure why we don't, right? I'm not sure we just need to push it I think with Congress. The Hearth Act was, added to the Long-Term Leasing Act. I forget exactly when that was now, forget when it was enacted. But in any event, the same kind of thing could be done for other components of tribal energy development. And honestly, that's not just energy. The Hearth Act applies to any leases and, rights of way, same thing. So those are, I think, great suggestions. Did anybody else want to say anything before we got 5 minutes left? Were there other things that folks wanted to say or mention? We've covered a lot.
I guess the only thing I'll say, just because I guess I have to say something. When we look at energy sovereignty, because I know that's a key word that we hear all the time, and I don't know if it we ever put a true terminology or understanding on it, but I really want to share with all of our participants that for me, and at least for our team with the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energies, when we look at energy sovereignty, we don't instantly think that it's a yes for X, Y, and Z. When we look at energy sovereignty, we always say energy sovereignty is the ability to say yes and the ability to say no. And tribes are the only sovereign entity besides the federal government who carries that ability.
Good point. Good point.
Great
So-
mic drop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So unless there are other thoughts, I think we will wrap it up. And I just want to say again, thank you to all our panelists. You all have such deep experience and expertise, and it's really and different insights into all these elements of tribal energy development. So thank you so much for sharing them with everybody and us.
Thanks, Susie, for moderating. And all the panelists. This has been phenomenal.